Continuing our discussion of post-processing effects, let's jump down to the lens effects, where you'll find the real fun stuff. Lens effects simulate real camera lens effects at runtime. So if you're a photographer, if you've ever worked with a digital or even an analog camera, you'll know some of the basic options such as ISO and f-stops and all of that. And you may also be familiar with things like depth of field and lens dirt and exposure settings. So you're going to have all of those options here under lens effects that you can use. Of course, a lot of these settings are not settings that the human eye is going to experience. Some of them are, but generally a lot of these, such as chromatic aberration and lens dirt, you're not going to see this on the human eye. So using these really depends upon where you want to go with the scene. If you want it to feel like you're physically there as a person and you're walking through, or if you want it to be more like it's a camera, then that's going to affect how many of these effects that you choose to use. Now, before we dive into these, let's go into our project settings and have a quick look at some of the options we have there. If we go down to engine rendering and then scroll down to the bottom here to default settings, you'll find bloom, ambient occlusion, and auto exposure, as well as some other things, motion blur. You can enable these here, and these are scene-wide effects. Even without a post-processing volume, these will work. But you can also enable these separately within the post-processing volume, so we don't have to really enable any of these here. And of course, using the post-process volume, when we enable those in the project settings, these settings here will allow us to control the intensity of those settings and other parts of those effects. Now, I will say that exposure should be added to your scene very last. You want to add everything else before you begin to play with the exposure settings. You also do not want to use all of these effects because they will stack up and become sometimes a little overbearing, but also will affect performance. A little goes a long way, so try not to use these too much. Just use them to kind of kiss in some effects to get that nice little extra bit of realism. Find the ones that you really like and that give you the most bang for your buck. We'll start out by looking at chromatic aberration. Now this has only two settings, intensity and the offset. So I'll bring intensity up really high, kind of exaggerated so you can see the effect, and I'll do the same thing with the start offset here a little bit. So you can see what's happening here is that there's a little bit of a distortion, a barreling effect to the lens. As well, there's some separation of the colors, simulating a lens that's kind of old, creating the chromatic aberration effect. This can be kind of distracting though, and if you only use it very subtly, it can soften the image a little bit. So if you're going for a softer look, this might be the option for you. Next up we have bloom, which is a very popular effect to use. Now you have a lot of options under bloom here, and you open up the advanced options here too to get even more, but we're just going to use it very simply in this situation. Bloom is a simulation of HDR effects, and it's not really physically accurate, but it works in most situations. If you've done a lot of 3D rendering, you're probably already very familiar with bloom. I'm going to adjust the intensity and the threshold. We'll set my intensity to 1 and then my threshold to 8. Look up here at some lights. We can really see that bloom kicking in the mirror over there. So intensity, obviously, that's going to scale the bloom color linearly. And then threshold, what that does is the lower this value, the greater amount of colors in your scene will affect the bloom. So if we brought this all the way down to -1, you can see the bloom is much softer. It's being affected by almost the entire scene. As we bring it up, it starts to tighten in on just a certain range of colors. And I'm going to bring mine up all the way to the top so that only the brightest whites will affect it. All right, moving on, we'll look at the dirt mask now. This allows you to add lens dirt, scratches and dust speckles and whatnot. What this requires is a dirt mask texture, so we'll enable that. And I'll go into my textures folder here. I have a dirt mask. Go ahead and drop it in there. So the dirt mask needs to have some special settings applied to it. So we'll open it up in the texture editor. And really all we want to make sure of is that it's not using any MIP maps. So no MIP maps. And then we don't want to stream this texture. So if you look under texture and then open the advanced settings, you'll find never stream. Just make sure that that is checked. Now, I'm not going to be using a dirt mask in my scene because it can be kind of distracting, but it's a really pretty effect actually. I'm going to go ahead and enable the intensity and pump it up really high, and then we'll look towards something really bright, something with a lot of bloom, and you can just make out the speckles appearing. There we go, on the side, kind of at the corner there, you can see some really nice speckling going on. Again, this one can be kind of distracting. It just depends on the look you're going for. After dirt mask, you have your camera settings for ISO and f-stop and all of that. However, these do not work in a post-process volume. These are only usable if you're doing post-process effects using a physical camera inside of Unreal. Next up, we have exposure. We're going to skip over that for now because, as I said, you want to do your exposure settings last. Below this, we have lens flares. Again, probably something you're very familiar with if you're doing any 3D rendering. I'm just going to turn on intensity so we get our lens flare there. Below this, we have the ability to tint the color of the lens flare. We can control the bokeh size, so I'll bring this up a little bigger. Okay, next up we have image effects, and with image effects you can add things like vignetting and camera grain. So if you're going for an older kind of look, an old film look, you can get that here using vignetting and then of course camera grain. All right, so now we have more of an old film kind of look, and we could even use color grading here to add a sepia tone to this if we wanted to do something like that. We're going for a more realistic look here, so we're not going to use any of these image effects. Finally, we have depth of field. I'm going to use bokeh depth of field because I find it's the best looking depth of field, but you do have several other options. You can use Gaussian or circle depth of field. For this, I'm going to set a focal distance of about 150. I'm going to bump the scale up, but just a little bit, just kiss it in to a value of about 0.1. Obviously, I could go much higher, and we can see it just blurs out the entire scene, but I'm going to bring it way down. Could probably go down even a little bit lower. I'm going to set my max bokeh size, though, to 5 instead of 15, and that subdues the effect quite a bit. You can control the focal region, the near transition and far transition, and a lot of other stuff, and there are, of course, a lot of advanced settings underneath it as well. But this is really all I need for the effect I'm going for. So the cool thing here is that we have a nice soft blurring or depth of field very close, and then everything else is pretty much in focus. Now with depth of field, you may have issues where your transparent objects do not blur out. That's easily solved if you just go ahead and select your transparent object and then open the translucent material for that. When you select the material node, scroll down under translucency and make sure that you have render after depth of field unchecked. Under rendering features, you'll find some more post-process effects. We're going to talk about ambient occlusion in the next segment, but let's look at screen space reflections first. So the scene in Unreal by default has screen space reflections working, and generally you're going to see those screen space reflections on the edges of smooth mirrored objects, and the rest of this is being done using a reflection capture actor. But if we go ahead and just look at the edge here, this is where the transition between reflection capture and screen space reflections usually happens. You can just kind of make out the transition occurring there as I move around a little bit. It's kind of rough, but it's not too bad. However, we can improve this a little bit if we go under screen space reflections, click intensity, click quality, and click max roughness. You have 3 options here for controlling these settings. Now, I'm going to leave my intensity at a value of 100, but I'm going to boost up my quality to a value of 100 as well. Now, it may not be very noticeable, but the idea is that boosting up your quality will give you a much better reflection. Another way to improve the quality of screen space reflections is in your project settings. So we'll go there and do a quick search for reflection. Now, the reflection capture resolution by default is at 128. I've set mine to 512. You can go as high as 1024 here. When you do that, of course, it's going to rebake the reflection captures. Just bear in mind, as you're raising those quality settings, it's going to affect the performance of the environment because you're increasing the overall size of the texture that's generated by a factor of 4 when you go from 512 to 1024. So if we look around our scene with auto exposure settings enabled, we'll see the changes as we go from dark to light. So you can see here as I went into this darker hallway, it's really brightening up. If I turn around, it instantly goes back down, or not instantly, but much quicker. I'm going to pretty much leave these settings at default because I like the way they look. But we can actually visualize the exposure, the auto exposure, using a histogram. You'll find the visualization under Show, Visualize, HDR-I adaptation. This is a histogram showing you the settings that you have here for the maximum brightness, min brightness, and so forth. And as I turn around, there's my maximum brightness before it comes down. And so you can see the histogram is reacting, the auto exposure is reacting, so that white line represents the adaptation that's occurring. So if I turn around, you can see it goes down much slower to get to the lower level there. So I'm going to set my speed down to a much lower value here and then turn around, and we can see by lowering it, the speed of the histogram to adapt is going much, much slower. Let's go ahead and set that back to 1. Same thing works with speed up. We'll bring this way down to 0.1, turn around, and we can see it's affecting the speed as my eyes adapt to the brighter environment. Let's go ahead and set this back to 3. Using these effects are really easy, but using them comes at great cost to the performance of your real-time walkthrough. Remember, in the case of these effects, a little goes a long way, so we don't want to overuse them. Adjust the settings by tiny increments until you get the look you want. And pick a few you think add the most bang for your buck. Don't try to use them all because they can overwhelm each other, and remember again, the performance will be impacted. Next up, we'll look at one more effect, and that's screen space ambient occlusion with a little discussion on some of your other AO options.